Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we are going to embark on a long, quiet journey back through the mists of time, wandering into the deep, untamed forests of ancient Europe to discover the very origins of France and the enigmatic people known as the Franks. When I sit back and reflect on the map of modern Europe, it strikes me just how deeply our contemporary borders and nations are taken for granted. We look at the beautiful hexagon of France today, with its bustling cities, endless vineyards, shimmering coastlines, and rolling fields of lavender, and it is almost impossible to imagine a time when this land was a vast, unbroken ocean of dark, whispering trees. Before the grand chateaux of the Loire Valley, before the majestic cathedrals with their stained glass windows, and long before the cobblestone streets of Paris were ever laid, there was a wild, untamed land known as Gaul. Imagine, if you will, a crisp autumn evening thousands of years ago. The air is thick with the scent of pine needles, damp earth and wood smoke drifting lazily through the heavy forest canopy. Celtic tribes, intimately connected to the rhythms of nature, sit around crackling fires, built within the protective embrace of ancient oak groves. I find it truly fascinating how these early societies, living so closely with the seasons and the harsh realities of the natural world, crafted a culture so deeply steeped in myth and druidic mystery. Theirs was a land of countless local deities, of sacred rivers and hidden springs where the wind rustling through the turning leaves was interpreted as the voices of the ancient gods, whispering secrets to those willing to listen. It is a deeply peaceful image, a world moving at the slow, deliberate pace of the sun and the moon. But history, as we know, is rarely completely still. To the south, beyond the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Alps, the shadow of a growing empire was reaching out. Rome, with its insatiable appetite for expansion, order, and resources, turned its ambitious gaze toward these fertile, sprawling lands. When we think of Julius Caesar and the Roman conquest of Gaul, it is so easy to get lost in the military tactics, the grand speeches in the Senate, and the massive political chessboard of the ancient Mediterranean. But what I always try to picture is the sudden, jarring clash of two entirely different worlds colliding in the quiet mist. Try to envision the straight, unyielding lines of stone-paved Roman roads cutting ruthlessly through ancient root systems and sacred groves. Imagine the metallic, rhythmic clinking of Roman legionary armor, the heavy thud of hobnailed sandals echoing in green valleys that had only ever known the songs of birds, the rushing of water, and the hunting calls of the Celtic tribes. It must have felt like the end of the world for the people living there, the sky itself falling as an unstoppable machine of iron and discipline marched through their ancestral homes. As the centuries rolled by, however, the dust settled, and Gaul slowly became Romanized. The wild, raw edges of the Celtic landscape were smoothed over by the architects of the empire. Grand bathhouses with heated floors, towering aqueducts carrying fresh mountain spring water across deep valleys, and massive stone amphitheaters rose from the soil where wooden palisades once stood. The Roman peace, the famous Pax Romana, settled over the landscape like a heavy, comforting blanket. farms grew wealthy. Vineyards were planted on the sun-drenched hillsides of the south, and a new Gallo-Roman culture blossomed, blending the deep, spiritual roots of the Celts with the structured, luxurious lifestyle of the Mediterranean. Yet, as with all great sprawling empires in the history of our world, the fringes and the distant borders were always restless, always humming with a quiet, persistent tension. Far away from the bustling forums of Roman Gaul, toward the cold, murky, fast-flowing waters of the river Rhine, a new chapter was slowly and quietly being written in the mud and the frost. The Romans considered the vast, dark lands beyond the eastern banks of the Rhine to be a terrifying, unknowable frontier. They called the dense, impenetrable woods the Hercynian forest, a place they believed was filled with monstrous beasts and endless gloom, and they called the people who lived there barbarians, a sweeping, dismissive term that completely stripped away the rich, complex tapestry of countless unique Germanic tribes living out their lives in the shadows of the trees. I always find it a bit ironic how history is almost exclusively written by the victors, or in this case, the urbanized empire builders, leaving us centuries later to painstakingly reconstruct the truth of these wilder, freer peoples from the very texts that were originally meant to diminish and mock them. Among these shifting, migrating, and constantly evolving groups in the dense, freezing forests of Germania, a new coalition was beginning to form. They did not suddenly appear out of nowhere like a storm on the horizon. Rather, they were a gradual, practical merging of smaller, pragmatic tribes. The Salians, the Ripuarians, the Chatti, and several others slowly realized that they were much stronger together than they were apart. They needed unity to survive the harsh winters, the encroaching pressures of other nomadic tribes pushing from the far east, and the ever-present, looming threat of the Roman legions across the water. They called themselves the Franks. The very word Frank is shrouded in historical and linguistic debate among scholars, but the most beautiful and widely accepted translation is simply the fierce, or, perhaps more romantically and fittingly, the free people. It is such a powerful, evocative concept when you think about the world they lived in. A world dominated by an empire built on subjugation and rigid law. Picture these free people standing on the eastern banks of the river Rhine in the dead of winter. The river is half frozen, chunks of white ice bobbing and grinding against each other in the dark, swirling current. The wind is biting and relentless, sweeping down from the north. The men and women are wrapped in thick, heavy layers of animal furs, wool, and leather, their breath plumbing in the icy air like dragon smoke as they look across the water toward the warmth, the wealth, and the heavily guarded stone watchtowers of Roman Gaul. They are incredibly patient. They watch the Roman patrols, cloaked in red, pacing up and down the opposite bank, their spears catching the pale winter sunlight. The Franks listen to the distant, muffled sounds of a civilization that is slowly, inevitably, beginning to crack under its own immense weight. Its borders stretched too thin, its political heart in Rome, rotting from corruption and endless civil wars. The true origins of France do not begin with a single, cinematic, dramatic battle on an open field, but rather with this slow, creeping realization, along a freezing riverbank, that the old world was finally ending and a new one was waiting to be forged in the chaotic fires of migration and desperate survival. We must remember that the Franks of this early era were not just mindless raiders or bloodthirsty conquerors looking to burn everything to the ground. They were primarily farmers, tight-knit families, skilled metalworkers, and fierce warriors looking for better, safer land. They were driven by the basic human desire to protect their children and find a place where their crops would not fail and their homes would not be pillaged by rival tribes. When I imagine their temporary settlements, the smoke from hundreds of small campfires dotting the dark eastern shores of the Rhine, beneath a blanket of cold stars, I see a people deeply connected to their iron weapons, their ancestral pagan gods of thunder and war, and their fierce independence. They were completely unaware that their descendants, the children of these freezing, mud-soaked warriors, would one day cross that river, dismantle the remnants of Roman authority, and build one of the most powerful, influential, and culturally rich nations on the face of the earth. As the 2nd and 3rd centuries slowly approached, a subtle but devastating change began to creep across northern Europe. The global climate began to cool significantly. The warm, reliable summers that had allowed the Germanic tribes to grow their crops began to shorten. The winters became brutally long, burying their longhouses in deep, suffocating snowdrifts. The harvests grew thinner, year after year, bringing the ever-present spectre of famine to their wooden doors. This changing climate, combined with the sheer necessity of survival, pushed the Franks closer and closer to the river's edge. They began to test the Roman defenses, launching small, swift raids across the Rhine, in flat-bottomed wooden boats in the dead of night, probing for weaknesses in the invisible, heavily fortified wall that divided the wild from the tamed, the free from the subjugated. They were feeling out the edges of an empire that was no longer invincible, slipping like shadows through the muddy forests, leaving only footprints and a growing sense of dread among the Roman border guards before vanishing back into the endless, dark woods of Germania. For the Roman soldiers, stationed in these lonely, isolated watchtowers along the Rhine, the deep woods of Germania became a living, breathing nightmare. You can almost picture these young men, conscripted from the warm, sun-baked hills of Italy or the dry plains of Hispania, suddenly finding themselves standing guard in the freezing, relentless drizzle of a northern European autumn. They huddled beneath heavy woolen cloaks, their bronze and iron armor cold to the touch, staring out into a vast, impenetrable sea of black trees that seemed to swallow the light. Every snapped twig, every sudden gust of wind rattling the bare branches, and every unfamiliar cry of a nocturnal bird could have been the signal for a Frankish ambush. The frontier was not a neat, clean line drawn on a map, but a messy, terrifying, and deeply porous zone of constant tension. Yet, as the years stretched into decades and the decades bled into centuries, something profound and completely unexpected, began to happen along this watery border. The relationship between the desperate, migrating Franks and the weary, overstretched Roman Empire began to shift from pure hostility to a complex, uneasy interdependence. I always find it absolutely fascinating how borderlands, no matter how heavily guarded or steeped in conflict, eventually become melting pots of human experience. The strict lines between us and them inevitably begin to blur. It started slowly, quietly, at the muddy river crossings and the fortified trade outposts. A Frankish warrior might cautiously approach a Roman camp, not with a raised axe, but with a bundle of thick, high-quality beaver pelts, or a beautifully crafted piece of amber from the distant Baltic coast. Looking to trade for Roman iron, a sturdy hunting knife, or perhaps a clay amphora of sweet Mediterranean wine. These brief, tense moments of bartering in broken Latin and harsh, guttural Germanic dialects were the very first subtle seeds of a new Europe being planted in the mud. Over time, the Roman commanders, who were constantly desperate for more fighting men to defend an empire that was slowly rotting from within, recognized the sheer, undeniable martial skill of the Franks. They were exceptionally brave, incredibly hardy, and fiercely loyal to their warlords. It is a classic tale of history, is it not? The great empire, too exhausted to fight its own battles, begins to hire the very barbarians it once feared to guard its gates. The Romans began to recruit individual Frankish warriors, and eventually entire tribal warbands, to serve as auxiliaries in the Roman army. These men were known as the foederati, allied troops who fought under the Roman eagle, but retained their own weapons, their own commanders, and their own brutal ways of making war. Imagine the surreal sight of a Roman legion marching down a stone-paved road in Gaul during the late 3rd century, alongside the disciplined, uniform ranks of traditional Roman infantry. You would see a massive contingent of Frankish warriors. They were taller, broader, their long, blonde and red hair tied back or braided, carrying their iconic throwing axes, the Francisca, and heavy wooden shields painted with the swirling, abstract symbols of their pagan gods. They wore trousers, a garment the early Romans had once mocked as utterly barbaric, but had now practically adopted to survive the freezing northern winters. This was the slow, silent infiltration of the Roman world by the very people who would eventually inherit it. The Franks were not destroying the empire from the outside. They were slowly, steadily becoming the military backbone of the empire from the inside. They learned Roman military tactics. They observed Roman engineering, and they intimately understood the logistical networks that kept the cities of Gaul fed and supplied. When I reflect on this era, it feels less like a violent conquest and more like a massive, slow-moving tide, creeping up a beach, quietly filling in the gaps and hollows left behind by a receding sea. The most crucial turning point in this quiet infiltration occurred in the middle of the 4th century. The Salian Franks, one of the most prominent and powerful confederations within the Frankish identity, had been steadily pushing across the lower Rhine, driven by the cooling climate and the pressure of other tribes behind them. They moved into a marshy, flat, misty region, known to the Romans as Toxandria, which roughly corresponds to the modern-day Netherlands and northern Belgium. This was a difficult, boggy landscape of winding river estuaries, deep mud, and dense reed beds, a place the Romans found highly undesirable and difficult to control. Rather than expend precious blood and gold trying to push the Salians back across the river, the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate made a deeply pragmatic, world-changing decision. In the year 358, he officially granted the Salian Franks the right to settle permanently in Toxandria. In exchange for this land, the Salians agreed to become subjects of the empire, providing troops to the Roman army and defending that stretch of the border against other, more hostile Germanic tribes. This was a monumental moment. The Franks were no longer just raiders or temporary mercenaries. They were now legally recognized inhabitants of Roman Gaul. They had a home within the empire. They began to build permanent farming settlements in the damp earth of Toxandria. They raised cattle, planted crops in the peaty soil, and raised their children in a land that was technically Roman, but was rapidly becoming fundamentally Frankish. You can picture their wooden longhouses rising from the morning mist, the smoke from their hearths mingling with the thick river fog, the sound of children playing in the muddy fields, the rhythmic striking of a blacksmith's hammer forging agricultural tools instead of weapons, and the quiet, low chanting of women tending to the crops. It is a deeply peaceful, domestic scene, completely hidden away in the marshlands. Yet it was the true, humble cradle of the French nation. The Salian Franks had taken root in the soil of Gaul, and their roots were deep, thirsty, and incredibly strong. They were a patient people, willing to bide their time, slowly growing in numbers and influence, as the mighty Roman infrastructure around them began to creak, fracture, and crumble under the weight of endless civil wars and economic collapse. They stood in the damp, quiet marshes, watching the Western Empire slowly die, ready and waiting to step into the vast, echoing void that would soon be left behind. The void, of course, did not open all at once, but rather tore apart in slow, agonizing fractures across the continent. As the 5th century dawned, the shadows cast by the dying Roman Empire grew incredibly long and dark over the forests of Gaul. The year 406 is one that echoes with a hollow, terrifying ring in the annals of European history. I often try to imagine the sheer, visceral terror of that exceptionally brutal winter. The mighty river Rhine, the ancient, flowing barrier that had separated the Roman world from the wild unknown for centuries, completely froze over. It was an event of almost apocalyptic proportions for the people living along its banks. The ice grew so thick, so solid, that tens of thousands of desperate, starving men, women, and children from other Germanic tribes, the Vandals, the Alans, and the Suebi, simply walked across the frozen river in the dead of night. The sound of thousands of boots and hooves crunching on the thick ice in the freezing darkness must have been deafening, a terrible harbinger of an era coming to a violent end. The Roman border defenses, already stripped to the bone to fight civil wars in Italy, utterly collapsed. The floodgates were opened. and Gaul was suddenly plunged into unimaginable chaos as these migrating nations swept through the wealthy Roman provinces, searching for food and land. Yet, amidst this terrifying storm of migration and destruction, I find it incredibly compelling to look at what the Salian Franks were doing. They did not join the pillaging horde. Instead, holding true to their treaties, these Frankish warriors, living in their damp settlements in Toxandria, actually stood their ground and fought back against the invaders on behalf of Rome. The supposed barbarians had become the very shield of the crumbling empire. It is a profound twist of historical fate. They fought fiercely, bleeding into the snow, to protect the Roman roads and cities that their ancestors had once raided. Although they could not stem the massive tide of the crossing, their loyalty and their martial prowess solidified their absolute dominance in northern Gaul. As Roman central authority completely evaporated, leaving local magistrates and panicked citizens to fend for themselves, the people of Gaul naturally began to look to the Franks, not as conquerors, but as the only viable protectors left in a world gone mad. When the law of the distant emperor fails, you turn to the man with the axe who is willing to stand in front of your door. Out of this chaotic twilight emerged a legendary lineage of Frankish kings, a dynasty that would shape the destiny of Europe, the Merovingians. Their origins are deeply entwined with myth and magic, a beautiful, misty blend of Germanic paganism and emerging historical truth. The dynasty was named after a semi-mythical leader named Merovech. Legend whispers that Merovech was not just a mortal man, but was conceived when his mother, a Frankish queen, went swimming in the ocean and encountered a magical sea creature, a quinator, a beast resembling a bull with 5 horns. It is exactly the kind of rich, enchanting folklore that I absolutely love about ancient history. It tells us so much about how these people viewed their leaders, not just as skilled generals, but as figures imbued with the wild, untamed magic of the natural world itself. The Merovingian kings were easily recognizable by their incredibly long, uncut hair. To cut their hair was to strip them of their royal, magical essence, a profound symbol of their connection to the ancient gods of the deep forest and the churning sea. The true test of this emerging Frankish power came in the year 451, a moment that truly decided the fate of Western civilization. From the distant, endless steppes of the East, a terrifying new threat had arrived: Attila the Hun. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila had forged an empire of horseback warriors that terrified even the hardiest Germanic tribes. When Attila's massive army swept into Gaul, leaving a trail of burning cities and unimaginable devastation in his wake, an unprecedented alliance was formed. At the Battle of the Catalaunian plains, a vast, open stretch of land in northeastern France, the last great Roman general, Aetius, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Visigoths, the Alans, and, crucially, the Salian Franks. Picture that breathtaking, terrifying morning, the heavy fog lifting off the damp grass to reveal tens of thousands of warriors. The air was thick with the smell of horses, sweat, and absolute fear. The Franks, under the command of Merovech, fought fiercely on the Roman right flank, swinging their heavy iron throwing axes and thrusting their spears in a desperate, grinding struggle against the devastating, lightning-fast cavalry charges of the Huns. The noise of clashing iron, the screams of horses, and the raw, guttural roars of men, locked in mortal combat, would have been overwhelming. It was a battle of sheer endurance, a bloody, chaotic twilight struggle that ultimately succeeded in halting Attila's advance and saving Gaul from total annihilation. The Franks had bled for Gaul, and in doing so, they had inextricably tied their bloodline to the future of the land. Following this apocalyptic clash, the Merovingian power only grew under Merovech's son, Childeric the First. Childeric was a fascinating figure, the very embodiment of a transitional king. He was a Roman ally, holding the title of a Roman governor, yet he was fundamentally a pagan Frankish warlord. He ruled from the city of Tournai, turning a Roman administrative center into the heart of a new barbarian kingdom. When I think of Childeric, I do not picture a man in a crisp white toga. I picture a king draped in rich, dark purple silk, a strict Roman symbol of authority, but wearing heavy gold rings, intricate garnet jewelry, and a brutal iron sword resting casually at his hip. His reign represents that beautiful, messy blending of two completely different worlds. The Roman stone and the Frankish iron were slowly being forged together in the crucible of the 5th century. By the time of Childeric's death, the Roman Empire in the West was a mere ghost, a hollowed-out shell. But the Franks were vibrantly alive, deeply rooted in the soil, and perfectly positioned to build an entirely new world upon the magnificent, crumbling ruins of the old. The passing of Childeric the First in the year 481 left a heavy, uncertain silence hanging over the damp, winding streets of Tournai. When I picture the funeral of this great transitional warlord, I imagine an atmosphere thick with the pungent scent of burning pine, roasted meats, and the low, mournful chanting of thousands of Frankish warriors gathered beneath the grey, overcast northern sky. Childeric was not buried with the quiet, humble prayers of the encroaching Christian faith, but rather with the raw, heavy, earth-shaking rituals of the old pagan gods. Deep in the dark soil, a massive burial chamber was excavated, lined with heavy timber. I find it utterly captivating how archaeology, centuries later, allows us to peer directly back into this exact moment. When his tomb was finally unearthed, long after his name had faded into legend, they found him surrounded by the ultimate symbols of barbarian royalty. Hundreds of exquisitely crafted golden bees, their wings inlaid with deep red garnets, had been sewn into his burial cloak, catching the faint light even after 1,000 years in the dark. Beside him rested his brutal iron axe, his throwing spear, and the severed heads of dozens of his prized war horses, sacrificed to carry their master across the misty veil into the afterlife. It was a profound, violent, and deeply poetic farewell to a king who had straddled the line between two crumbling eras. Into this massive, echoing void stepped his son, a young man whose name would echo through the centuries and become the very bedrock of the French monarchy. His name was Clotilde, though history remembers him more smoothly as Clovis. Clovis was only 15 years old when he stood beside the open earth of his father's grave, the heavy gold signet ring of the king, now resting securely on his own youthful finger. Just 15. When I reflect on this, I try to imagine the immense, crushing pressure settling onto the shoulders of a teenage boy. He was surrounded by massive, battle-hardened warlords with long, braided hair and scarred faces, men who respected only strength, cunning, and the ability to provide them with plunder and rich farmland. He had to prove instantly that he was not just a boy playing dress-up in his father's armor, but a wolf ready to lead the pack. And Clovis, as history would brutally reveal, was a master of both patience and sudden, devastating violence. At this time, Gaul was a shattered mosaic of competing powers. To the south of the Frankish lands, centered around the city of Soissons, lay a strange, isolated pocket of the old Roman world. It was ruled by a man named Syagrius, who proudly called himself the King of the Romans, though he was entirely cut off from Rome itself. This kingdom of Soissons was like a severed limb that had somehow managed to keep living, a final, stubborn fortress of Roman law, Latin speech, and disciplined infantry, surrounded by a rising sea of Germanic tribes. Clovis, with the cold, calculating eye of a visionary, looked at this wealthy, fertile Roman remnant and knew exactly what he had to do. In the year 486, the boy king, now 20 years old, summoned the Salian Frankish war bands. They marched south, leaving the deep forests and entering the sunlit, cultivated fields of Roman Gaul. The Battle of Soissons was not just a clash of swords. It was the definitive, final death rattle of Roman authority in Western Europe. Imagine the tension on that battlefield. On one side, the desperate, heavily armored Roman remnants, standing shoulder to shoulder behind their large rectangular shields, holding the line for a ghost empire. On the other side, the roaring, unarmored Frankish warriors hurling their heavy axes with terrifying force, shattering the Roman shield wall with the sheer, overwhelming momentum of a new age. Clovis crushed Syagrius completely. The Frankish borders surged forward, swallowing cities, vast estates, and incredibly wealthy Roman churches. It is during the aftermath of this victory that we hear one of the most famous, defining stories of Clovis's early reign, a story that perfectly illustrates the delicate, dangerous balance act of his rule. It is the legend of the Vase of Soissons. As the Franks looted the conquered lands, a particularly beautiful, massive silver chalice was taken from an important Christian church. The local bishop, desperate to save this holy relic, sent a quiet plea directly to Clovis, begging for its return. Clovis, showing a political shrewdness far beyond his years, agreed to return it, hoping to win the favor of the powerful Gallo-Roman bishops, whose support he would desperately need to rule this newly conquered Roman population. But Frankish law was strict and egalitarian when it came to loot. Everything was divided by casting lots, even for the king. Picture the scene in the center of the muddy encampment. The massive pile of glittering plunder is gathered before the army. Clovis points to the stunning silver vase and politely asks his warriors if he might take it outside of his normal share to return it. Most of the men, respecting his victory, nod in agreement. but one warrior, arrogant, fiercely independent, and fiercely protective of the old Frankish ways of equality, steps forward. I always imagine the absolute silence that must have fallen over the camp. The warrior raises his iron axe and brings it crashing down onto the beautiful silver vase, denting and slicing it, shouting that the king shall have nothing but what the strict drawing of lots gives him. It was a direct, humiliating challenge to Clovis's authority in front of his entire army. A lesser king might have flown into a rage, but Clovis simply swallowed his pride. He quietly picked up the damaged, crushed silver vase, handed it to the bishop's envoy, and said nothing. He waited. He allowed the seasons to turn, brooding on the insult in the dark cold of winter, proving that the true origins of this kingdom were built not just on raw power, but on cold, terrifying patience. A full year passed in a tense, brooding silence. When the biting winds of early spring finally swept away the winter snow, Clovis summoned his entire army for the traditional annual military review. A massive gathering, known as the Marchfield. Tens of thousands of warriors assembled in a vast trampled meadow, standing in long, disciplined lines. The air was crisp, filled with the sharp, metallic tang of polished iron, wet leather, and the heavy breath of horses. Clovis, his face an impenetrable mask of cold authority, walked slowly down the lines, carefully inspecting the weapons and armor of his men. You can almost hear the rhythmic, squelching sound of his boots in the thick spring mud as he paced past the silent, watching ranks. He stopped suddenly. He stood directly in front of the very same warrior who had so boldly defied him exactly 1 year earlier over the silver vase. Clovis stared at the man for a long, heavy moment, the silence stretching out until it became almost unbearable. Then, with a voice as cold as ice, Clovis berated the man, loudly declaring that his weapons were dirty, his scepter dull, and his armor poorly maintained. Before the warrior could even utter a single word of defense, Clovis reached out and violently snatched the man's axe from his hands, throwing it onto the muddy ground. The warrior, his face flushing with humiliation in front of the entire assembled army, slowly bent down to retrieve his fallen weapon from the mud. As he did, Clovis drew his own heavy iron axe and, with a terrifying, calculated swing, brought it crashing down into the man's skull. "Thus you did," Clovis roared, his voice echoing across the silent, stunned field. "To the Vase at Soissons. When I reflect on this moment, it strikes me just how deeply calculated and profoundly transformative this single, brutal act was. It was not merely a sudden outburst of petty, delayed revenge from an angry young man. It was a terrifying, brilliant piece of political theatre. In that one split second, as the arrogant warrior fell dead into the spring mud, the old Frankish tribal traditions of absolute equality among warriors died with him. Clovis was violently declaring to every single man in that field that the days of the warlord, being just a first among equals, were permanently over. He was no longer just a tribal chieftain drawing lots for plunder. He was an absolute, unquestionable monarch who held the power of life and death over every single subject in his realm. The sheer terror and awe that swept through the ranks that day cemented his authority in a way that 10,000 peaceful treaties never could have. No one ever dared to question his share of the spoils, or his absolute right to rule, ever again. With his grip on his own army now completely unshakable, the young king turned his ambitious gaze outward once more. He had conquered the last Roman enclave, but Gaul was still a dangerous, highly fractured landscape. To the southeast, in the beautiful, mountainous region surrounding the Rhone River Valley, lay the powerful and wealthy kingdom of the Burgundians. Clovis knew that to secure his newly expanded borders, he needed more than just raw iron and terrifying reputation. He needed the subtle, binding power of a strategic alliance. He needed a queen. Through a complex web of envoys and delicate diplomatic whispers, Clovis arranged a marriage that would alter the destiny of Europe forever. He chose a Burgundian princess named Clotilde. Clotilde was a fascinating, quietly powerful figure. She was entirely different from the rough, pagan Frankish women of Clovis's court. While many of the Germanic tribes, like the Visigoths and the Burgundians, had converted to a heretical version of Christianity known as Arianism, Clotilde was a fiercely devout, Orthodox Catholic. I always try to picture her arrival in the Frankish heartland. Imagine a long train of wooden wagons and armed guards emerging from the misty, dense forests, carrying a young woman dressed in fine, elegant silks, clutching a small silver cross. She was leaving behind the relative warmth and refined Romanized culture of the Burgundian court, to live among a people who still worshipped the ancient, bloodthirsty gods of the deep woods, people who still sacrificed horses to accompany their dead kings into the afterlife. The atmosphere of their meeting must have been incredibly charged. Here was Clovis, the brilliant, brutal pagan warlord, with long hair and hands stained with the blood of his enemies, standing face to face with Clotilde, a woman of deep, unbending spiritual conviction and quiet, luminous faith. It is the classic, timeless story of the warrior and the saint. But in this case, the political and cultural stakes were quite literally the future of the entire Western world. Clotilde did not arrive in the Frankish court to simply be a silent, obedient wife. She brought with her a profound, unwavering mission. From the very moment she stepped into Clovis's wooden mead halls, breathing in the scent of roasting meat and wood smoke, she began a slow, patient, and incredibly persistent campaign to convert her terrifying new husband to her Catholic faith. She spoke to him constantly of her God, contrasting the eternal peace and structured morality of the Christian heavens with the chaotic, violent twilight of the pagan pantheon. Clovis, however, was a deeply pragmatic man. He listened, perhaps amused, perhaps slightly intrigued by her passion, but his power was entirely rooted in the fierce loyalty of his pagan warriors. To abandon the ancient gods of his ancestors, the very gods his men believed granted them victory in battle, was a risk that this deeply calculating king was simply not ready to take. And so, an invisible but deeply intense spiritual war began to quietly rage within the royal household. The gentle, persistent chanting of Clotilde's private priests, completely surrounded by the raucous, mead-soaked feasts and pagan oaths of the Frankish warlords. this profound clash of worlds within the royal household finally came to a devastating, deeply personal climax with the birth of their first child. When I try to picture the ancient Frankish royal residence, I don't imagine a sweeping stone palace with high arched windows. Instead, I see a massive, heavily fortified timber complex, smelling of raw earth, wood smoke, and the damp wool of the guards patrolling the wooden palisades outside. In the dim, flickering light of these halls, Princess Clotilde gave birth to a son, a boy named Ingemer. For Clovis, this was a moment of supreme, triumphant validation. A strong, healthy male heir secured the fragile dynasty he was building with blood and iron. But for Clotilde, the birth of her son was a desperate spiritual imperative. She was absolutely determined that the boy would not be raised to worship the dark, ancient entities of the forest. She insisted, with a quiet but unyielding iron will, that the child be baptized into the Catholic faith. Clovis, perhaps exhausted by her endless persistence, or perhaps simply indulging his beloved queen in a moment of joy, reluctantly agreed. Imagine the hushed, secret atmosphere of that baptism, far from the grand cathedrals of later centuries. This would have taken place in a small, shadowy room. A lone Catholic priest, his voice barely a whisper, to avoid drawing the ire of the heavily armed pagan guards. Outside the heavy wooden door, poured blessed water over the infant's forehead from a simple silver bowl. It was a beautiful, tender moment of faith, taking root in the harsh northern soil. But history, as it so often does, turned on a knife edge of unimaginable tragedy. Mere days after wearing the white robes of his baptism, the infant Ingemer fell gravely ill. His breath grew shallow, the fever spiked, and despite the frantic use of both Roman medicine and Frankish herbal lore, the child quietly passed away in his mother's arms. The grief that consumed the royal household must have been utterly suffocating. But for Clovis, this profound sorrow instantly mutated into a terrifying righteous anger. To his pragmatic warrior's mind, the cause of the boy's death was terrifyingly obvious. He roared through the smoky halls, his voice filled with a heartbreaking mixture of agony and vindication. He loudly proclaimed to Clotilde and all his listening warlords that if the boy had been dedicated to the ancient, powerful gods of his ancestors, the gods of thunder and war, he would have lived. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that Clotilde's gentle, unseen god of peace was too weak to protect a Frankish prince in this brutal world. When I reflect on this terrible moment, I feel a deep wave of empathy for Clotilde. She was mourning the loss of her firstborn son, entirely isolated in a foreign, hostile court, while her grieving husband weaponized her own faith against her. Yet her resolve did not shatter. She buried her child, retreated into the quiet solace of her prayers, and patiently endured the dark, suffocating winter of Clovis's anger. Time, however, is a slow but effective healer, and the royal lineage demanded continuation. A year later, a second son was born, a boy they named Clodomer. Once again, the battle lines within the marriage were drawn. Clotilde, completely unbowed by the previous tragedy, demanded that this child, too, must be washed in the holy waters of baptism. You can only imagine the sheer, towering fury of Clovis He fiercely resisted, terrified of angering his ancestral gods a second time, terrified of losing another son to the perceived weakness of this foreign religion. But Clotilde's faith was an immovable mountain. Through tears, pleas, and a quiet, terrifying conviction, she ultimately prevailed. Clodomir was baptized. And then, as if the ancient pagan gods were truly testing the very fabric of their marriage, the absolute unthinkable happened. Little Clodomir grew sick. The exact same fever, the exact same shallow breathing, the exact same terrifying shadow creeping over the wooden cradle. Clovis was plunged into a state of absolute despair. He paced the longhouses like a trapped, wounded bear, bitterly mocking Clotilde's faith, grimly stating that this boy, too, would follow his brother into the dark earth because he had been baptized in the name of a powerless deity. He began to prepare himself for the inevitable, brutal reality of burying another child. But Clotilde did not despair. She did not weep in resignation. Picture her in the dead of night, the wind howling violently against the heavy timber walls of the royal enclosure, while the rest of the household slept a heavy, anxious sleep. The queen knelt on the cold, hard, earthen floor beside the crib. She prayed with a desperate, burning intensity that seemed to defy the cold reality of the illness. She prayed for the life of her son. Yes, but she also prayed for the soul of her husband, knowing that the survival of this child was the only thing that could ever crack the impenetrable iron armor of his pagan worldview. And then, slowly, miraculously, as the pale, grey light of the morning sun began to filter through the cracks, in the wooden shutters, the child's fever broke. The heavy, ragged breathing softened into a peaceful, rhythmic slumber. Clodomir opened his eyes. He would live. I always find myself smiling when I picture the look of sheer, profound confusion that must have washed over Clovis's scarred face as he stood over that crib. His entire understanding of how the universe operated had just been violently shaken. The boy baptized in the name of the Christian God had survived what the pagan gods seemingly could not cure. Clovis did not instantly fall to his knees and convert, of course. He was far too stubborn, far too cautious a king for such sudden theatrics. But a tiny, microscopic fracture had appeared in his ancient beliefs, a seed of doubt, planted by the desperate prayers of a grieving mother, had taken root in the darkest soil of his mind. He would need all the strength and clarity he could muster, because the world outside his walls was not waiting for him to resolve his spiritual crisis. A massive, terrifying storm was gathering to the east, beyond the borders of the newly expanded Frankish kingdom. A fierce, sprawling confederation of Germanic tribes known as the Alemanni had grown hungry and restless. The Alemanni, whose name loosely translates to all men, were renowned for their brutal, overwhelming numbers and their savage ferocity in combat. They began to aggressively push across the upper Rhine, burning villages, slaughtering the frontier guards, and driving deep into the territory of Clovis's allies. The time for quiet reflection in the royal chambers was over. The deep, heavy sounding of iron war horns echoed through the valleys of Gaul, calling the Frankish warbands to muster. Clovis strapped on his heavy iron sword wrapped himself in thick furs, and rode east to meet a threat that would push his army, his kingdom, and his very soul to the absolute breaking point. The journey to meet the Alemanni was not a swift, glorious parade, but a grueling, exhausting slog through dense, unforgiving terrain. The Frankish army moved like a massive, bristling serpent through the ancient forests, the ground churning into a thick, dark soup of mud beneath the feet of tens of thousands of marching men and horses. The air was perpetually damp, filled with the sharp, metallic clinking of chainmail, the rattling of wooden shields, and the low, anxious murmurs of warriors who knew they were marching toward a truly terrifying enemy. The Alemanni were not a decaying Roman remnant. They were wild, fierce, and incredibly numerous, a confederation of tribes whose very name struck terror into the hearts of their neighbors. When I read the ancient chronicles describing this impending clash, I am always struck by the sheer, suffocating tension that must have hung over the Frankish encampments each night. Clovis, riding at the head of his host, must have felt the crushing weight of his entire kingdom resting solely upon the edge of his iron axe. He was marching not just to defend his borders, but to defend his absolute legitimacy as a warlord. To lose to the Alemanni meant the total annihilation of everything he had built since he was a 15-year-old boy. The two massive armies finally collided in the year 496 near a place called Tolbiac, which is modern-day Zülpich in Germany. Try to picture the raw, unvarnished horror of an ancient battlefield before the first blow is even struck. The landscape was a wide, uneven plain, flanked by dark, brooding woods. A cold, biting wind swept across the grass, carrying with it the deafening, guttural war cries of the Alemanni host. They stood in dense, terrifying formations, beating their weapons rhythmically against their wooden shields, creating a thundering, percussive roar that you could feel rattling deep within your own chest. On the other side stood the Franks, equally fierce, their long hair whipping in the wind, their eyes fixed on the massive wall of enemy warriors. Then, with a sound like a mountain collapsing, the two lines crashed together. The Battle of Tolbiac was not a tactical masterpiece of sweeping cavalry flanking maneuvers or brilliant Roman-style engineering. It was a brutal, chaotic, incredibly violent meat grinder of hand-to-hand combat. The sheer sensory overload must have been paralyzing. The air was thick with the copper smell of blood, the choking dust kicked up by thousands of struggling feet, and the agonizing screams of dying men and horses. Clovis fought in the very thick of it, swinging his heavy axe, his armor splashed with mud and gore, his lungs burning in the freezing air. But as the hours dragged on in this agonizing twilight struggle, a cold, terrifying reality began to settle over the Frankish king. They were losing. The Franks were actually losing. The Alemannic numbers were simply too great, their ferocity overwhelming. Slowly, agonizingly, the Frankish shield wall began to buckle and break. Warriors, who had never known defeat under Clovis, were suddenly being pushed backward, slipping in the blood-soaked mud, panic beginning to spread like a wildfire through the ranks. Clovis roared at his men, desperately trying to rally his crumbling lines, calling upon the ancient pagan gods of war and thunder to grant them strength, to grant them victory, to shatter their enemies. But the sky remained a cold, indifferent grey. The pagan gods, it seemed, were completely silent. The slaughter continued. The Frankish army was on the absolute brink of total collapse, and with it, the entire Merovingian dynasty was mere moments away from being wiped from the pages of history. It is in this exact moment of supreme, suffocating desperation, amidst the deafening roar of slaughter and the terrifying realization of his own imminent death, that history pivoted on a single, astonishing act of faith. I always find this moment incredibly moving, regardless of one's personal beliefs, because it reveals the absolute raw vulnerability of a man who has completely run out of options. Clovis, his face covered in sweat and dirt, his lungs heaving, looked up at the dark, overcast heavens. His own gods had abandoned him. His army was dying. And so, in a moment of pure, desperate agony, he remembered the quiet, unyielding faith of his wife, Princess Clotilde. He remembered the boy who had miraculously survived the fever. Raising his eyes and his bloody hands to the sky, surrounded by the chaotic swirl of combat, Clovis cried out over the din of the battle. He called out to Jesus Christ, the God of Clotilde, the God who he had previously mocked as weak. He made a loud, desperate vow that echoed across the muddy, blood-stained field. He swore that if this Christian God would grant him victory over his enemies, if this God would save his people from total annihilation right here, right now, he would finally abandon the ancient idols of his ancestors. He would believe, and he would be baptized in holy water. What happened next is recorded in the ancient texts as a profound, undeniable miracle. Almost immediately after the words left his lips, a sudden, inexplicable shift occurred on the battlefield. The tide of the combat abruptly, violently turned. By some twist of fate, or perhaps by the sheer, desperate renewed energy of the Frankish king. Surging forward, after his vow, the leader of the Alemanni, their great and terrible king, was struck down and killed in the brutal melee. The news of his death ripped through the Alemannic ranks like a sudden, freezing wind. The fierce, terrifying warriors, who had been on the verge of total victory, suddenly lost their nerve. Their lines wavered, broke, and dissolved into absolute panic. The Franks, sensing the sudden collapse of their enemy, let out a massive, deafening roar and surged forward, turning a desperate defense into a devastating, overwhelming rout. The Alemanni began to throw down their weapons, turning and fleeing into the dark forests or falling to their knees in the muddy grass to surrender to the advancing Frankish warlord. When the slaughter finally ceased, an eerie, heavy silence descended over the battlefield of Tolbiac. The wind continued to blow across the thousands of fallen men, rustling the grass that was now stained a deep, dark crimson. Clovis stood leaning heavily on his iron axe, his chest heaving, his body completely exhausted. The victory was total. The Alemannic threat was completely crushed. Their lands now effectively his to absorb. He had won the greatest battle of his entire life, securing his kingdom and his legacy forever. But as he stood there in the quiet aftermath, looking at the grey, clearing sky, the absolute magnitude of what he had just done washed over him. I can only imagine the complex storm of emotions swirling in his mind. He was a deeply pragmatic man, a man of his word, and he knew exactly the price of this miraculous victory. He had made a binding pact on the edge of oblivion, and the god of his wife had seemingly delivered on his end of the bargain. The ancient gods of the deep forest were dead to him now. The time for resistance was over. He had to go home, look Clotilde in the eyes, and prepare to wash away the old world in the waters of a new faith. The journey back to the Frankish heartland was profoundly different from the anxious, muddy slog that had preceded the brutal clash at Tolbiac. The heavy, suffocating dread that had hung over the army was entirely gone, replaced by a strange, quiet awe. I often wonder what the ordinary Frankish warriors were whispering to each other around their campfires during that long march home. They had all seen it. They had felt the terrifying, crushing momentum of defeat suddenly, miraculously evaporate, replaced by a total and overwhelming victory. They knew their king had called out to a foreign god, and they had seen the terrifying Alemanni break and run like frightened deer immediately after. The ancient, bloodthirsty gods of the deep forest, the ones they had sacrificed horses to for generations, had seemingly been completely overpowered by the quiet, unseen deity of the queen. The atmosphere among the men was not one of rebellion or anger, but of a deep, unsettled curiosity. They respected strength above all else, and this new Christian god had just demonstrated a terrifying, undeniable power on the shattered battlefield. When Clovis finally rode back through the heavy wooden gates of his royal enclosure, Princess Clotilde was waiting for him. Picture that deeply intimate, quiet reunion. He was completely covered in the dried mud and blood of the campaign, his chainmail heavy, smelling of sweat, exhausted horses, and the raw, metallic tang of war. She was dressed in elegant, clean silk, her silver cross catching the pale northern daylight. He did not boast of his tactical brilliance or his martial prowess, as was the usual, boisterous custom of the victorious Frankish warlords. Instead, he quietly dismounted, approached his wife, and, in a voice, likely hoarse from screaming orders over the din of slaughter, simply told her that she had won. Her god had answered him in the dark. It must have been a moment of unimaginable, overwhelming relief for Clotilde. Years of patient, desperate prayer, years of enduring his terrifying anger, and mourning her firstborn son, had all culminated in this single, profound confession in the muddy courtyard. She did not gloat or boast. She immediately turned and sent her fastest riders out into the mist, galloping toward the city of Reims, to summon a man whose words would help forge the soul of an entirely new nation. His name was Remigius, the Bishop of Reims. Remigius was a living relic of a rapidly vanishing age, an incredibly learned, eloquent Gallo-Roman aristocrat who had spent his entire life desperately trying to preserve the flickering light of classical civilization and Christian morality as the Western Empire collapsed into ruin around him. The meetings between King Clovis and Bishop Remigius must have been an absolutely fascinating study in extreme contrasts. Imagine the two of them sitting alone by a roaring stone hearth fire late into the damp night, On one side, the towering, muscular Frankish warlord, a man who had spent his entire life mastering the brutal, unforgiving politics of the iron throwing axe. On the other side, the elderly, refined Roman bishop, draped in simple, elegant ecclesiastical robes, speaking soft, structured Latin, patiently trying to explain the complex, ethereal mysteries of the Holy Trinity to a man who fundamentally only understood loyalty, blood, and physical conquest. I always find it somewhat humorous to imagine Remigius delicately trying to explain the Christian concept of turning the other cheek to a king, who had quite literally cleaved a man's skull in two over a silver vase. Yet, Remigius was politically brilliant. He did not preach to Clovis like a subjugated servant, speaking to a barbarian master. He spoke to him as a wise spiritual father, slowly and carefully weaving the terrifying martial power of the Frankish army into the grand, divine narrative of the Catholic Church. But Clovis, ever the cold, calculating pragmatist, had one final, massive political hurdle to overcome before he could allow himself to step into the holy water. He was entirely willing to be baptized, keeping his desperate vow, but he was acutely aware that a Frankish king could not rule without the absolute, unshakable consent of his warriors. If he abandoned the ancient gods, the very gods his men believed gave them victory, would his army abandon him? He called an enormous, tense assembly of his greatest warlords and chieftains. The anxiety in the damp air must have been thick enough to cut with a sword. He stood before this massive sea of battle-hardened men, men who wore the crude symbols of pagan deities carved into their leather armor and painted on their wooden shields. And he began to speak. He told them of the miracle he had witnessed at Tolbiac, of the new, incredibly powerful God who had granted them their lives and their vast new lands. Before he could even finish his careful diplomatic plea, a sudden, miraculous wave of sound swept violently through the gathered ranks. According to the ancient, breathless chronicles, the massive crowd of warriors violently clashed their iron weapons against their shields and roared in perfect unison, declaring that they would gladly cast off the weak, mortal gods and follow the immortal God of their king. It was a sweeping, monumental validation. The Franks were a people who moved as a tight, loyal pack, and the alpha wolf had just confidently chosen a new, mysterious path through the dark woods, with the absolute loyalty of the army secured. The grand preparations for the royal baptism began in the city of Reims. The event was deliberately scheduled for Christmas Day, a date chosen for its profound, undeniable symbolic weight. The visual and sensory transformation of the city was an absolute masterclass in psychological theatre, carefully designed by Bishop Remigius to completely overwhelm the senses of the pagan Franks. The rough, muddy, functional streets of Reims were transformed into a vision of heaven on earth. Elaborate, brilliantly colored, woven tapestries depicting magnificent scenes from the Bible were hung from the crumbling stone walls of the surviving Roman buildings and draped over the wooden facades of the new Frankish longhouses. The heavy, sharp, everyday smell of wood smoke, wet dogs, and unwashed bodies that usually accompanied the Frankish host was entirely replaced by thick, swirling, intoxicating clouds of sweet, exotic incense, burning in massive bronze censers, swinging from chains. Candles, thousands upon thousands of expensive beeswax candles, were lit all along the procession route, their flickering light turning the damp, overcast winter morning into a glowing, warm, artificial sunrise, as Clovis walked slowly and deliberately toward the grand doors of the cathedral. Having finally laid aside his heavy chainmail, his furs, and his bloody iron axe, he was physically stepping out of the dark, violent history of the tribal forests and walking directly into the glowing, highly structured heart of the Middle Ages. As he stepped across the threshold of the Cathedral of Reims, the heavy iron-studded wooden doors slowly closing behind him, the sheer acoustic shift must have been absolutely breathtaking for the Frankish king. The chaotic, muffled sounds of the crowded, muddy city streets were instantly severed, replaced by the towering, cavernous, echoing silence of the massive stone interior. For a man who had spent his entire life beneath the open canopy of the deep forests or the chaotic din of the battlefield, the structured, soaring architecture of a Roman basilica must have felt like stepping inside the mind of a remarkably ordered, incredibly powerful deity. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of ancient stone, melting beeswax, and the sharp, floral notes of consecrated oils. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the dim, golden light filtering through the high clerestory windows, he saw Bishop Remigius standing patiently beside a magnificent, carved stone baptismal font. The bishop was flanked by a choir of monks whose voices suddenly rose in a slow, hypnotic, echoing Latin chant that completely filled the vast space, vibrating right down into the floorboards. I always try to imagine the sheer, overwhelming psychological weight of this specific moment. Clovis, the alpha wolf, the brutal conqueror of Roman Gaul, slowly walked down the long, central aisle. He was completely stripped of his iron armor, dressed instead in the simple, pristine white linen robes of a humble catechumen. The fierce, terrifying warlord had voluntarily made himself utterly vulnerable. As he approached the font, the chanting slowly faded away into a profound, heavy silence. Bishop Remigius looked deeply into the eyes of the young king, raised his hand in blessing, and spoke words that would echo through the entire history of the French nation. "Bow thy head, proud Sicambrian," the bishop commanded, using an ancient, poetic name for the Franks. "Adore what thou hast burned, burn what thou hast adored." With those heavy, poetic words hanging in the incense-filled air, the king of the Franks slowly bent his neck. Remigius poured the holy water over his long, blonde hair, officially washing away the ancient pagan warlord and birthing the very first Catholic monarch of the new European age. The medieval chronicles, which always loved to weave a thread of bright, golden magic into the tapestry of history, later claimed that the crowds were so thick that the priest carrying the holy chrism oil could not reach the font. And so, the legend says, a pure white dove descended directly from the heavens, carrying a small glass vial, the holy ampulla, filled with divine oil to anoint the king, while the modern historian in me knows this is a beautiful piece of retrospective myth-making. designed to legitimize the absolute divine right of later French kings. The storyteller in me absolutely loves it. It shows just how incredibly momentous, how truly earth-shattering this baptism felt to the people who witnessed it. It was not just a political treaty. They genuinely felt that heaven and earth had physically touched in the chilly waters of that stone font. But Clovis was not the only man to feel the cold water that day. Following the strict, unbreakable tribal bonds of loyalty that defined the Germanic peoples, a king did not walk a path alone. If the alpha wolf changed his course, the entire pack followed without question. Behind Clovis, an absolutely staggering 3,000 of his most elite, battle-hardened Frankish warriors stepped forward. These were the very same men who had swung their axes at Soissons, who had bled in the mud at Tolbiac, men who wore the scars of 100 brutal skirmishes. They stripped off their heavy furs, their leather belts, and their scarred weapons, and stepped into the water to be baptized alongside their king. You can almost smell the overpowering, highly unusual mixture of wet wool, unwashed warrior sweat, and sweet, burning church incense. It was an unprecedented mass spiritual migration. 3,000 hardened killers, bowing their heads and clumsily repeating Latin prayers they could not possibly understand, simply because the man who fed them and led them to victory had told them this was their new reality. The political shockwaves that radiated outward from the Cathedral of Reims that morning were absolutely monumental. By taking the Catholic sacrament, Clovis had not just secured the eternal salvation of his soul, as Clotilde had so desperately prayed for. He had just executed the single most brilliant, devastating geopolitical maneuver of the entire early Middle Ages. To understand why this was so crucial, we have to look at the massive, complex chessboard of Europe at that time. The other great Germanic kingdoms that had carved up the rotting carcass of the Roman Empire, the mighty Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Burgundians in the east, had all converted to Christianity decades earlier, but they had converted to Arianism, a sect that Orthodox Catholics viewed as a terrible, dangerous heresy. This religious divide had created a massive, simmering tension between these barbarian kings and the millions of ordinary Gallo-Roman citizens they ruled over, who were almost entirely Orthodox Catholic. The powerful, highly educated bishops of Gaul had felt like hostages in their own cities, surrounded by Arian overlords. But now, suddenly, looking out from the north, they saw Clovis. He was no longer a terrifying pagan outsider. He was one of them. He was the only Orthodox Catholic king in the entire Western world. Almost overnight, the narrative completely shifted. The Gallo-Roman bishops, who controlled vast networks of communication, immense wealth, and the hearts of the common people, began to view Clovis not as a barbarian invader, but as a divine liberator. When I reflect on this massive shift, I am struck by how perfectly faith and ruthless ambition aligned for the Frankish king. He didn't just win a kingdom with his axe. He won the absolute, unshakable loyalty of the Roman population with a splash of holy water. The gates of deeply fortified Roman cities that would have taken the Franks years of bloody, starving siege warfare to crack open, were suddenly, quietly unbarred from the inside by Catholic bishops eager to welcome their new champion, as Clovis turned his gaze southward toward the incredibly wealthy, sun-drenched lands controlled by the Arian Visigoths. He was no longer marching as a foreign conqueror looking for plunder. He was marching as a holy crusader, fully backed by the immense moral and logistical support of the Catholic Church. The wild, dark rivers of Frankish military might and the deep, structured reservoirs of Roman administrative power had finally, irreversibly merged together. The foundation stone of the French nation had been firmly, permanently set in the damp earth of Gaul, and the bloody, glorious expansion of the Merovingian dynasty was truly about to begin. With the spiritual backing of the Catholic Church now firmly secured, the Frankish armies began their massive, rumbling march southward. When I picture this particular campaign, I see a profound shift, not just in the politics of the era, but in the very landscape itself. The Franks were leaving behind the dense, damp pine forests, the freezing mud, and the grey, overcast skies of their northern homeland. As they pushed deeper into the heart of Gaul, toward the sun-drenched valleys of the Loire and the Garonne rivers, the world around them physically brightened. The air grew warmer. The smell of pine was replaced by the rich, earthy scent of vineyards, cypress trees, and sun-baked stone. This was the territory of the Visigoths, a powerful, incredibly wealthy Germanic kingdom that had ruled southern Gaul and Hispania for generations. The Visigoths were sophisticated. They wore fine Roman silks, bathed in heated waters, and fought as heavily armored cavalry. But crucially, as we know, they were Arian Christians. And, to the fiercely Catholic Gallo-Roman population living under their rule, the advancing Frankish army was not an invading horde, but a host of divine liberators. I find it absolutely fascinating how perfectly Clovis weaponized faith. As his army moved south, the massive, fortified wooden gates of important Roman cities simply swung open for him. Bishops secretly sent him supplies, maps, and intelligence. The Visigothic king, a man named Alaric II, realized with a cold, sinking dread that he was not just fighting an enemy army. He was fighting a massive popular uprising fueled by religious fervor. Alaric knew he could not wait behind city walls while the countryside actively rebelled. He had to meet the Franks in the open field and crush the head of the serpent. The two great Germanic nations, representing two entirely different visions for the future of Europe, finally met in the late summer of the year 507 at a place called Vouille near the modern city of Poitiers. Imagine the absolute spectacle of that late summer morning. The heat was already rising from the dry, yellow grass, causing the distant tree lines to shimmer and distort in the haze. On one side of the vast, dusty plain stood the Visigothic host. They were a breathtaking, terrifying sight, heavily focused on massive formations of elite, aristocratic cavalry. Their armor gleamed like polished silver under the blazing southern sun, their horses snorting and stamping the dry earth, waiting for the order to charge. On the other side stood the Franks. They were primarily infantry, an ocean of unarmored or lightly armored men holding heavy wooden shields, their throwing axes resting easily in their calloused hands. They looked rougher, darker, and infinitely more grounded in the dirt than their glittering Visigothic counterparts. But they had an unbreakable, terrifying momentum. The battle commenced not with a slow, tactical advance, but with a sudden, deafening, earth-shaking thunder. The Visigothic heavy cavalry lowered their lances and charged. A massive wall of iron and horseflesh surged across the dry grass, kicking up a choking cloud of pale dust that obscured the sun. The sound must have been utterly paralyzing, a rhythmic, deep drumming that vibrated through the soles of the Frankish boots. But the Franks did not break. They locked their wooden shields together, planted their feet deep into the dry earth, and waited until the very last, agonizing second to unleash a devastating, terrifying volley of heavy iron Franciscas into the charging horses. The sheer brutality of the collision was catastrophic. The elegant, sweeping cavalry charge was instantly turned into a chaotic, bloody tangle of screaming horses, shattered lances, and desperate hand-to-hand combat in the choking dust. It is in the very center of this suffocating, blinding chaos that the ancient chronicles tell of a legendary, almost mythical encounter. The two kings, Clovis and Alaric II, found each other in the swirling melee. I always try to visualize this specific duel not as a clean, heroic clash of swords, but as a desperate, exhausting, violently uncoordinated struggle in the stifling heat. Clovis, the hardened, pragmatic survivor of the northern mud, against Alaric, the refined, aristocratic lord of the southern sun. In a final, devastating climax, Clovis struck Alaric down, his heavy iron weapon shattering the Visigothic king's defense and ending his life in the bloody dust. The death of a king in the ancient world was not just a tragic loss. It was a profound, immediate tactical catastrophe. When the Visigothic nobles saw Alaric fall beneath the Frankish axe, their morale completely evaporated. The glittering cavalry turned their horses and fled in absolute panic, abandoning the infantry and leaving the vast, wealthy southern provinces completely defenseless. The Battle of Vouille was a total, crushing victory for the Franks. The power of the Visigoths in Gaul was permanently broken, sending them retreating over the high, snowy peaks of the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, never to return. The aftermath of the battle was a period of incredible, unprecedented expansion and unimaginable wealth for Clovis. He marched his victorious army unopposed into Toulouse, the magnificent, wealthy capital of the Visigothic kingdom. Picture the rough, mud-stained Frankish warriors walking with wide, astonished eyes through the opulent, sun-drenched palaces of Toulouse. They found treasuries overflowing with Roman gold, massive silver plates, beautiful, intricate jewelry, and vast stores of sweet southern wine. The sheer scale of the plunder was beyond anything the northern tribes had ever seen or even imagined. Clovis had effectively doubled the size of his kingdom in a single, devastating stroke. He now controlled a massive, sprawling territory that stretched all the way from the freezing, muddy banks of the Rhine in the far north, down through the rich, fertile heartland of Gaul, all the way to the sun-baked, rocky shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The wild, migrating tribe of the freezing forests had become the absolute, undisputed masters of the Western European world. The massive, sprawling territory that Clovis now controlled was entirely unprecedented for any Germanic warlord. But as the intoxicating haze of victory began to fade, a profound and heavy realization settled over the Frankish court. Holding land with the sharp edge of an iron axe is vastly different from actually ruling it, organizing it, and ensuring it survives the turning of the seasons. Clovis was no longer just a tribal chieftain migrating through the dark woods. He was the master of a vast, complex society consisting of millions of Gallo-Roman citizens who expected law, infrastructure, and order. When I reflect on this specific period of his life, I see a man rapidly, almost frantically, trying to transition from a legendary warrior into a true statesman. He needed to anchor his new empire, to give it a beating heart, and to legitimize his violent conquests in the eyes of the wider, civilized world. The validation he so desperately needed came from the most magnificent, distant city on earth. Far to the east, across the glittering expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, lay Constantinople, the magnificent, unfallen capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Emperor Anastasius, sitting on his throne of gold and porphyry, was watching the chaotic events in Gaul with a deeply calculating eye. Anastasius had no love for the Arian Visigoths or the Ostrogoths who occupied Italy, and in the fiercely Catholic, incredibly successful king of the Franks, he saw a highly useful, terrifyingly effective ally. And so, a grand diplomatic embassy was dispatched from the sun-drenched shores of the Bosphorus, carrying a fleet of ships loaded with unimaginable treasures, sailing toward the damp, northern kingdom of Clovis. Picture the arrival of these Eastern Roman envoys at the Frankish court. It was a clash of absolute, breathtaking extremes. The Byzantine diplomats were draped in layers of the finest, most delicate silks, smelling of rare Eastern spices, carrying themselves with the ancient, rigid, highly structured dignity of the Roman court. They approached the towering, scarred Frankish king and presented him with the ultimate symbols of imperial recognition. They draped a magnificent, heavy purple tunic over his shoulders, the absolute, exclusive color of Roman imperial authority. They placed a diadem upon his head and officially bestowed upon him the title of honorary consul. The sheer psychological weight of this moment cannot be overstated. For the millions of ordinary Gallo-Roman farmers, merchants, and bishops living under Frankish rule, Clovis was suddenly no longer just a terrifying barbarian conqueror who had won by right of slaughter. He was now officially recognized by the Emperor of the Roman world as a legitimate, divinely appointed magistrate. The rough, violent edges of the Frankish conquest were suddenly smoothed over and cloaked in the majestic, unbroken authority of ancient Rome. With this glittering imperial validation secured, Clovis turned his attention to the very landscape of his realm. A kingdom of this massive, sprawling size could no longer be ruled from a damp, isolated wooden longhouse in Tournai or a moving military encampment. He needed a true capital a central hub of power that could control the vital river trade routes and project his authority across the newly conquered lands. He chose a small, relatively obscure settlement situated on a muddy, teardrop-shaped island in the middle of the river, Seine. The Romans had called it Lutetia, but it was slowly becoming known by the name of the local Celtic tribe that had originally settled there, the Paris. I find it absolutely deeply fascinating to strip away the grand, romantic image of modern Paris and imagine it exactly as Clovis first saw it. There were no soaring Gothic cathedrals with intricate stained glass, no wide, elegant cobblestone boulevards lined with cafes, and certainly no glittering iron tower piercing the night sky. The Paris of King Clovis was a rough, heavily fortified, muddy outpost. The island, which we now know as the Île de la Cité, was surrounded by thick, heavy wooden palisades built directly over the crumbling stone ruins of old Roman walls. The Seine River, dark, fast-flowing, and prone to violent flooding, acted as a massive natural moat. You can almost hear the rhythmic splashing of flat-bottomed wooden ferry boats crossing the murky water, the shouts of merchants hauling heavy barrels of wine up the slippery mud banks, and the constant ringing strikes of blacksmith hammers echoing from the cramped, smoke-filled courtyards. Clovis chose Paris not for its beauty, but for its absolute, undeniable strategic brilliance. It was perfectly positioned in the very center of the northern Gallic road networks, allowing his armies and his tax collectors to move swiftly in any direction. It is a beautiful irony of history that the City of Light, the modern global capital of art, romance, and high culture, truly began its ascent to greatness as a heavily guarded, muddy fortress chosen by a long-haired barbarian warlord, looking for a defensible island to hoard his plunder. Clovis ordered the construction of a new, grand basilica on the left bank of the river, dedicated to the Holy Apostles, firmly planting the architectural seeds of his new Catholic dynasty deep into the Parisian soil. But a true kingdom requires far more than just a fortified island and a heavy iron crown. It requires the invisible, binding architecture of the law. Up until this point, the Franks had been governed entirely by an unwritten, highly fluid oral tradition. Justice was often a terrifyingly simple matter of violent blood feuds, where an insult or a murder was settled by the absolute right of tribal vengeance, leading to endless, chaotic cycles of retribution between families. Clovis, now holding the purple tunic of a Roman magistrate, knew that this wild, destructive system of tribal justice could not sustain a massive, settled agricultural empire. He undertook a monumental project that would become one of the most enduring, influential achievements of his entire reign. He ordered the creation of the Lex Salica, the Salic law. Imagine a quiet, shadowy room deep within the royal complex in Paris. The air is thick with the smell of hot beeswax candles and damp parchment. Around a heavy, scarred oak table sit the greatest, most fearsome Frankish warlords, men with braided hair and deeply scarred faces. Beside them sit the highly educated, refined Gallo-Roman Catholic bishops and scribes, holding delicate feather quills and pots of dark iron Gaul ink. Together, in this incredibly tense, fascinating cultural exchange, they began to painstakingly translate the ancient, violent customs of the dark forest into the structured, permanent written Latin of the Roman world. The Salic Law was not a grand philosophical treatise on human rights. It was a highly practical, incredibly detailed price list for violence. It sought to end the chaotic, endless blood feuds by replacing them with a system of strict financial compensation known as the wergild, or man price. Every single conceivable injury, theft or insult was meticulously assigned a specific monetary value. If you cut off a man's hand, you owed a certain amount of gold coins. If you stole a hunting dog, if you burned down a barn, or if you insulted a woman, there was a strict, unyielding fine that had to be paid to the victim's family. It was a profound, fundamental shift in human behavior. The heavy, indiscriminate swing of the iron axe was slowly, painfully being replaced by the quiet, heavy scratch of the quill. The wild, untamed nature of the Frankish tribes was being systematically chained, ordered, and structured. Clovis was building a machine that would outlast his own mortal life, ensuring that the origins of France were rooted not just in the bloody mud of the battlefield, but in the enduring, invisible bedrock of the written word. The invisible bedrock of the written word had been laid. Yet the physical reality of the world Clovis inhabited was still governed by the cold, sharp edge of the blade. When I look back at the final years of King Clovis, I am always struck by a profound and deeply unsettling contradiction. The church chronicles, written by the very bishops he protected, paint a glowing, almost saintly portrait of a divine champion, a new Constantine, sent by God to unite the faithful. But if you strip away the beautiful, glowing tapestries and look closely at his actual actions, the man who emerges from the shadows is a terrifyingly ruthless, cold-blooded political mastermind. The Salic Law was designed to stop ordinary men from killing each other over stolen cattle. But Clovis firmly believed that a king, to truly secure his dynasty, operated entirely outside the boundaries of that law. Though he had crushed the Romans, the Alemanni, and the Visigoths, his absolute power was still threatened by the existence of other, smaller Frankish kingdoms along the river Rhine. The most prominent of these were the Ripuarian Franks, ruled by an aging, battle-scarred chieftain named Sigebert the Lamb. Sigebert had been a loyal ally. He had actually sent troops to help Clovis fight at Tolbiac and Vouille, suffering a crippling wound to the knee in the process. But in the dark, paranoid calculus of early medieval power, an ally today was simply a rival tomorrow. Clovis knew that as long as another Frankish king drew breath, his own sons would never be truly secure. And so, he orchestrated a masterclass in dark, Machiavellian betrayal that would have made the most cunning Roman emperors shudder. He did not march an army against Sigebert. That would have been too costly and would have broken the sacred bonds of tribal hospitality. Instead, Clovis sent secret, whispering envoys into the deep woods to find Sigebert's ambitious son, a young warrior named Childeric. Picture this tense, shadowy meeting in the freezing northern forest. The royal envoy, his face hidden beneath a heavy woolen hood, softly whispers, poisoned words into the young prince's ear. He tells Childeric that his father is growing too old, too weak to lead the fierce Ripuarian warriors. He suggests, with chilling calmness, that if Sigebert were to suddenly pass away, Clovis would fully support Childeric's claim to the throne and share his vast wealth with him. The young man, blinded by ambition and the glittering promise of gold, took the terrible bait. A few days later, while the old, crippled King Sigebert was peacefully walking through the ancient, towering beech trees of the Buconian forest, resting in a small sunlit clearing, his own son's assassins stepped out from the shadows and struck him down. It is a brutal, heartbreaking image. A warlord who had survived 100 desperate battles, murdered in the quiet woods by the ambition of his own flesh and blood. But the dark web Clovis had spun was only half complete. As soon as Childeric excitedly sent messengers to Paris to claim his terrible prize and offer Clovis a share of his father's treasury, the trap slammed shut. Clovis's own hidden assassins, pretending to be envoys arriving to inspect the promised gold, suddenly drew their weapons and violently murdered the young, treacherous prince as he was bending over an open chest of coins. With both the father and the son dead, their blood soaking into the muddy earth, Clovis immediately rode east to the Ripuarian capital. He stood before the shocked, leaderless assembly of their greatest warriors. With absolute, chilling composure, he raised his hands and loudly swore that he had absolutely nothing to do with these terrible assassinations. He publicly condemned the son for murdering the father and mourned the tragic death of the son. Then, in the heavy, uncertain silence that followed, he generously offered them his own protection. Bereft of their royal family and terrified of the chaos that would follow, the Ripuarian Franks eagerly raised Clovis up on their heavy wooden shields, enthusiastically proclaiming him their absolute, undisputed king. It is almost breathtaking in its sheer, magnificent audacity. Through whisper and dagger, without risking a single one of his own soldiers in open battle, Clovis had completely absorbed the last remaining independent Frankish kingdom, uniting all the scattered tribes under his single, iron rule. But the heavy, crushing weight of wearing the crown, the endless years of plotting, marching, and slaughtering, eventually begin to take their toll on even the strongest of men. As the year 511 approached, the alpha wolf was visibly slowing down. I try to imagine Clovis in his final days, confined to the heavily guarded, smoky interior of his wooden palace on the island of Paris. His long blonde hair was now streaked with heavy iron grey. His powerful, muscular frame, scarred by decades of close-quarters combat, was now stiff and aching from the damp chill that constantly rose from the dark waters of the Seine. He spent his final weeks listening to the quiet, rhythmic chanting of the monks in the nearby basilica, perhaps feeling the heavy gaze of Princess Clotilde, whose patient prayers had so completely altered the trajectory of his life. When the King of the Franks finally closed his eyes and breathed his last, the silence that fell over the kingdom was absolutely profound. He was only 45 years old, but he had lived a dozen lifetimes of violence and achievement. The funeral of Clovis was a magnificent, solemn affair, completely stripped of the wild, pagan horse sacrifices that had accompanied his own father into the dark earth. He was carried on a heavy wooden bier, draped in rich purple silk, and surrounded by thousands of weeping warriors and chanting Catholic priests to the newly constructed Basilica of the Holy Apostles in Paris. He was laid to rest in a heavy stone sarcophagus, the first king of France to be buried in the city that would become the eternal heart of his nation. He had taken a fractured, migrating tribe of forest warriors and forged them into the absolute, undisputed masters of Western Europe. But history, in its endless turning wheel, rarely allows a masterpiece to remain whole. The very traditions that made the Franks so fiercely loyal also contained the seeds of their own tragic, bloody unraveling. Unlike the Roman Empire, where power was usually passed down to a single chosen heir, or the later medieval systems of strict primogeniture, where the eldest son took everything, the Frankish custom of inheritance was devastatingly egalitarian. To a Frank, a kingdom was not a sacred, indivisible state. It was considered the personal, private property of the king, and just like a herd of cattle or a chest of gold. When the father died, his property had to be divided absolutely equally among all of his surviving male heirs. Clovis left behind 4 ambitious, heavily armed, and incredibly dangerous sons: Theuderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar. They gathered in the damp halls of Paris around a large map of Gaul, completely ignoring the natural boundaries of rivers and mountains, and carved the magnificent, unified kingdom their father had built into 4 separate sprawling pieces. It was a recipe for absolute disaster. Almost immediately after the heavy stone lid was placed over their father's tomb, the brothers began to eye each other's territories with dark, terrifying ambition. The unified, unstoppable momentum of the Frankish expansion suddenly ground to a halt, turning violently inward upon itself. The dark, whispering trees of Gaul were about to bear witness to a century of unimaginable fratricidal warfare as the sons of the wolf turned their iron axes against their own blood in a desperate, endless struggle to piece their father's broken crown back together. To truly understand the absolute chaos that engulfed the Frankish world in the decades following the death of the great King Clovis, we must look closely at the completely bizarre, tangled map that his 4 sons created. They did not draw neat, logical lines along rivers, mountain ranges, or linguistic boundaries, as a modern architect of nations might do. Instead, they sliced the magnificent kingdom up, based entirely on the agricultural and financial tax value of the land. They created a chaotic, interlocking puzzle of territories that practically guaranteed endless, bloody border disputes. Theuderic, the eldest, took the heavily Germanic north and east, ruling from the damp, fortified city of Metz. Clodomir claimed the rich, fertile Loire Valley, setting his throne in Orléans. Childebert took the prestigious, fortified island center of Paris, and the youngest, the utterly ruthless Clothar, established his court at Soissons. When I sit and look at the historical maps of this heavily fractured era, it strikes me as a deliberate recipe for absolute, inevitable disaster. It was exactly like putting 4 starving, battle-scarred wolves into a single, tightly locked wooden cage and throwing a fresh piece of meat directly into the center. They were bound by blood, but they were entirely consumed by the exact same terrifying ambition that had driven their father. At first, a fragile, deeply uneasy peace settled over the divided kingdom, largely held together by the formidable presence of the Queen Mother, Clotilde. She had retreated to the quiet, echoing stone cloisters of the Basilica of Saint Martin in Tours, dedicating her days to quiet prayer, tending to the poor, and desperately trying to act as the moral anchor for her 4 fiercely aggressive sons. The brothers, looking for an outlet for their warriors' restless energy and a way to gain plunder without attacking each other, decided to turn their unified gaze outward. They remembered that their mother, Clotilde, had been a Burgundian princess whose own parents had been brutally murdered by her uncle years before she had ever met Clovis. In a rare moment of familial unity, the brothers agreed to march south, to finally avenge the ancient blood debt of their mother, and to conquer the wealthy, mountainous kingdom of the Burgundians. The campaign began with the familiar, terrifying roar of the Frankish war machine. The combined armies of the brothers marched through the dense, muddy valleys, their heavy iron axes, eager for the rich plunder of the south. But the illusion of brotherly invincibility was violently shattered at the Battle of Soissons in the year 524. Picture the suffocating, dusty chaos of that clash. The Frankish infantry surged forward, their wooden shields splintering under the heavy impact of Burgundian cavalry in the very thick of the swirling, blinding melee. The second eldest brother, King Clodomir of Orléans, became separated from his royal bodyguard. The ancient chronicles describe how he was thrown from his horse into the deep mud, completely surrounded by enemy warriors. Despite fighting with the desperate, wild fury of his lineage, he was struck down. The Burgundians, realizing exactly who they had killed, cut off his head, placed it upon the end of a tall wooden spear, and raised it high above the battlefield for the entire Frankish army to see. The visceral horror of seeing their king's head, his long, royal blonde hair whipping in the wind, completely broke the morale of the Orléans contingent, and the Frankish advance ground to a sudden, devastating halt. The death of Clodomir was a tragic loss, but in the dark, cold-blooded calculus of the Merovingian dynasty, his death created an incredibly dangerous political vacuum. Clodomir left behind 3 very young, completely helpless sons. Following the strict Frankish customs, these 3 little boys were the absolute rightful heirs to the incredibly wealthy kingdom of Orléans. Immediately following their father's death on the muddy battlefield, the 3 terrified children were brought to Paris and placed under the fiercely protective wing of their grandmother, Queen Clotilde. I always try to imagine the quiet, domestic scenes inside her royal apartments during this tense period. She loved those boys with a desperate, all-consuming passion, seeing in their small faces the echoing ghosts of the son she had just lost to the spear, and perhaps even the ghosts of the infants she had lost so many years ago in her youth. She spent her days brushing their long, uncut blonde hair, the absolute, sacred symbol of their royal Merovingian blood, whispering to them that they would one day grow up to be great kings, just like their grandfather, Clovis. But outside the warm, heavily guarded doors of Clotilde's chambers, a truly terrifying, cold-blooded plot was beginning to take shape in the shadows. Childeric, the king of Paris, and Clotilde, the king of Soissons, looked at the sprawling, wealthy, highly taxable lands of Orléans and felt the dark, familiar grip of pure greed. They knew that if their 3 young nephews were allowed to grow into men, they would rightfully inherit their father's kingdom, completely locking their uncles out of the wealth. The 2 kings began to exchange secret, whispering messengers in the dead of night. They agreed, with a chilling lack of hesitation, that the boys simply had to be removed. But they could not simply march armed men into their mother's chambers. The political scandal would have been absolutely catastrophic, and the loyalty of the army would have completely fractured. They needed to pry the children away from Clotilde's protective embrace through deception. The 2 brothers sent a warm, respectful message to their mother, Clotilde, falsely claiming that they wished to officially crown the 3 young boys as kings, to elevate them to the thrones they rightfully deserved. Clotilde, completely blinded by a grandmother's profound love and an eager, hopeful desire to see her son's children honored, believed the lie. She dressed the 3 little boys in their absolute finest, brightly colored silk tunics, kissed their foreheads, and willingly sent them out of her safe, guarded apartments to meet their uncles in the grand hall. It is one of the most agonizing, heartbreaking moments in all of ancient history. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind the children, cutting them off from their grandmother forever. The moment the boys were separated from her guards, they were immediately seized, violently separated from their personal servants, and locked in a dark, cold stone room deep within the palace. What happened next is a story so incredibly brutal, so completely devoid of human empathy, that it perfectly encapsulates the terrifying reality of the Dark Ages. Childeric and Clotilde did not want to execute the boys immediately, without first ensuring their legal right to rule was completely severed. They sent a single, silent messenger to Queen Clotilde's private chambers. When the door opened, the messenger did not speak a single word. He simply walked forward and laid 2 objects down onto her heavy wooden table. One was a sharp, crude pair of iron shears. The other was a naked, newly sharpened Frankish broadsword. The messenger delivered the brothers' cold, terrifying ultimatum. The Queen Mother must choose the fate of her grandchildren. She could choose the iron shears, meaning the boys' sacred, long royal hair would be completely shaved off, permanently stripping them of their right to rule, stripping them of their royal identity, and forcing them to live the rest of their lives hidden away as silent, forgotten monks in a distant monastery. Or she could choose the sword. I find it almost impossible to fathom the sheer, suffocating agony that must have crushed Clotilde's chest in that exact moment. She was staring directly at the absolute, irredeemable wickedness of her own surviving sons. The ancient chronicler Gregory of Tours records her reaction, a reaction that has sparked endless debate among historians for centuries. In her overwhelming grief, her mind shattered by the unimaginable cruelty of the choice, she allegedly cried out that if they were not to be kings, she would rather see them dead than permanently shorn of their royal dignity and humiliated before the entire world. Whether she actually spoke those exact, fateful words in a moment of blinding, hysterical agony, or whether the messenger deliberately twisted her horrified weeping to serve the bloodthirsty desires of his masters, we will never truly know. The messenger swiftly picked up the naked sword and returned to the cold, echoing stone hall where the two kings were waiting in the shadows. He presented the sword, telling them that the queen had made her choice. What followed was a butchery that forever stained the legacy of the Merovingian dynasty. The youngest brother, King Clothar, a man whose heart seemed to be forged from entirely cold, unfeeling iron, personally walked into the dark room where his terrified young nephews were being held. He grabbed the eldest boy, who was only 10 years old, roughly by the arm. The child, screaming and crying in absolute terror, begged his uncle for mercy. But Clothar simply raised his heavy dagger and plunged it into the boy's chest, throwing his small body onto the cold stone floor. Hearing the agonizing screams of his older brother, the second child, who was only 7, broke free and ran desperately toward his other uncle, Childebert, wrapping his small arms around Childebert's legs, sobbing and begging for his life. For a brief, fleeting fraction of a second, the heavy, dark armor of Childebert's ambition seemed to crack. Looking down at the tear-streaked face of his little nephew, he began to weep. He looked up at Clothar and pleaded with him to stop, offering to pay any amount of gold to spare the child's life. But Clothar, his hands now completely soaked in the warm blood of his own kin, flew into a terrifying, uncontrollable rage. He roared at Childebert, insulting his courage, demanding that since Childebert had helped plan the plot, he must see it through to the end. Intimidated by his younger brother's sheer, psychopathic ferocity, Childebert slowly stepped back, completely abandoning the weeping child. Clothar immediately seized the 7-year-old boy, dragged him across the stone floor, and murdered him right beside his brother. I laugh only because the sheer, theatrical darkness of it all reads like the most twisted, violent, Shakespearean tragedy, yet this was the absolute, raw reality of early French politics. Only the youngest of the 3 boys, a toddler named Clodoald, managed to miraculously escape the slaughter. Smuggled out of a window in the chaotic darkness by some brave, loyal servants. He was hidden away in the deep countryside, where he eventually had his royal hair cut voluntarily, turning his back entirely on the bloody crown of his family to become a humble monk, eventually being canonized as Saint Cloud. But in the dark, blood-stained halls of Paris, the horrific deed was done. The 2 kings wiped their daggers clean, ordered the small bodies to be casually buried, and immediately rode out into the countryside to divide the vast, wealthy kingdom of Orléans between themselves, exactly as they had planned. Clotilde, absolutely broken in spirit, left Paris forever, carrying the unbearable weight of her tragic family back to the quiet cloisters of Tours. The origins of France had been secured by the brilliance of Clovis, but the soul of his dynasty was already plunging headfirst into a deep, inescapable abyss of violence, paranoia, and the darkest shadows of fratricide. The abyss that opened up after the murders in Paris swallowed the Frankish kingdoms whole, plunging the descendants of Clovis into a terrifying, seemingly endless cycle of civil war and betrayal. When I sit back and try to trace the chaotic, heavily tangled timelines of the Merovingian dynasty during this period, it genuinely feels like trying to untangle a massive knot of poisonous snakes. The brothers, having successfully eliminated their young nephews, almost immediately turned their dark, ambitious gaze toward one another. There was no grand, unifying vision for the future of Europe anymore. Only the raw, blinding desire to possess the most land, the most gold, and the most power. The beautiful, sunlit valleys of Gaul, which had finally known a brief moment of peace after the Roman collapse, were once again plunged into absolute misery. The common Gallo-Roman people, the farmers tending the vineyards, and the merchants navigating the rivers, suffered unimaginable horrors as massive Frankish armies constantly marched back and forth across their lands, burning crops and pillaging villages, simply to weaken a rival brother's tax base. The youngest brother, Clotilde, the very man who had personally driven the dagger into his weeping nephews, proved to be the ultimate, terrifying survivor of this bloody era. I find it deeply disturbing, yet historically fascinating, that a man with such profound, irredeemable cruelty in his heart managed to outlive every single one of his rivals. He watched his eldest brother die of illness. He watched his other brother die without a male heir. And like a patient, circling vulture, Clotilde slowly, methodically absorbed all of their territories. By the year 558, after decades of relentless bloodshed and dark political maneuvering, Clotilde finally achieved the impossible. He became the sole, absolute ruler of the entire Frankish realm, briefly reuniting the massive kingdom that his father Clovis had built. But imagine the sheer, suffocating hollowness of that victory. He sat alone on a heavy wooden throne in Paris, an old, deeply scarred man wrapped in rich silks, surrounded not by a loving family, but by the silent, haunting ghosts of the brothers and nephews he had betrayed and murdered to get there. His unified kingdom was an illusion, built entirely on a foundation of blood and fear. And the ancient gods, or perhaps the Christian god he supposedly worshipped, did not allow him to enjoy his bloody prize for long. Just 3 years after finally uniting the kingdom, Clotilde went on a hunting expedition in the deep, freezing woods of the forest of Quais. It is said that he contracted a sudden, terrifying fever that burned through his aging body like a wildfire as he lay dying on a rough wooden bed inside a dim hunting lodge, sweating and thrashing in agony. The ancient chronicles record him shouting a deeply revealing, blasphemous final sentence. He supposedly cried out to the empty room, asking what great, unseen king of heaven was powerful enough to strike down the mighty kings of the earth. Even with his dying breath, his mind could only comprehend the universe in terms of raw, absolute power and violent conquest. He could not fathom a force greater than his own iron will. It is the ultimate, tragic irony of the warlord, dying not on a glorious battlefield, but shivering and helpless against an invisible sickness. With the death of Clotilde, the exact same devastating historical mistake was repeated with terrifying precision. He, too, left behind 4 fiercely ambitious, heavily armed sons. And just as their fathers had done before them, these 4 sons gathered around a map of Gaul and completely shattered the unified kingdom once again. The Frankish world fractured into 3 distinct, massive, and constantly warring sub-kingdoms that would define European geography for the next century. In the east, encompassing the wild, heavily Germanic forests and the river Rhine, lay the kingdom of Austrasia. In the west, containing the wealthy, heavily Romanized cities and the fertile plains around Paris, lay the kingdom of Neustria. And to the south, the mountainous, fiercely independent kingdom of Burgundy. The borders between these 3 realms were not drawn with ink, but carved deeply into the earth, with the endless, rhythmic swinging of the iron axe. The Merovingian kings of this era became entirely consumed by their own internal rivalries. They spent their entire reigns plotting assassinations, launching massive, destructive raids into their brothers' territories, and marrying foreign princesses only to murder them when political alliances shifted. When I reflect on this incredibly dark century, I see a royal family completely rotting from the inside out, blinded by their own absolute privilege, and entirely neglecting the actual administration of their sprawling empire. But as the kings became more and more obsessed with their bloody family feuds, they unwittingly created a massive, silent power vacuum directly beneath their own thrones. To fund their endless civil wars and maintain the loyalty of their armies, the Merovingian kings began to slowly, carelessly give away vast tracts of royal land and immense wealth to their top aristocratic generals and administrators. The most powerful of these aristocratic officials held a title that would eventually change the entire course of human history. They were called the Mayor of the Palace. Originally, the Mayor of the Palace was simply the manager of the royal household, the man who organized the king's servants and managed his personal estates. But as the kings grew weaker, distracted by their endless wars, and increasingly retreating into lives of secluded luxury, the mayors of the palace quietly stepped into the void. They took control of the royal treasury. They commanded the royal armies, and they began to dispense justice in the king's name. It was a brilliant, almost invisible coup d'état taking place over generations. The kings with the incredibly long, sacred blonde hair still sat on the heavy wooden thrones wearing the purple robes and the golden crowns. But they were slowly becoming hollow, powerless figureheads, completely manipulated by the incredibly wealthy, fiercely intelligent mayors standing quietly in the shadows right behind them. The true power in Gaul was silently slipping away from the bloodline of Clovis, transferring into the hands of a new, incredibly ambitious, aristocratic family that was patiently waiting for the perfect moment to step entirely into the light. This new, incredibly ambitious aristocratic family was known as the Pippinids, a lineage that would eventually be remembered by history as the magnificent Carolingians. When I reflect on this slow, multi-generational transfer of absolute power, it feels like watching a massive, ancient oak tree being quietly strangled by a deeply rooted, vibrant green ivy. The later Merovingian kings, the descendants of the terrifying conqueror, Clovis, completely lost their grip on reality. They became known in the historical chronicles as the Roi Fainéants, the do-nothing kings. It is a deeply pathetic, almost tragic image. Instead of leading massive war bands into the freezing mud, these hollow kings were entirely sequestered in their luxurious rural estates. They were only brought out before the public once a year, traveling slowly down the dusty, sunlit roads, not on fierce war horses, but riding in slow, creaking wooden carts, pulled by plodding oxen, exactly like simple peasant farmers. They still wore the heavy golden crowns and possessed the incredibly long, sacred blonde hair, but everyone watching the slow procession knew that the true master of the realm was the fierce, calculating mayor of the palace, riding on horseback right beside the cart. The ultimate, defining test for this new, shadowy power behind the throne arrived in the early 8th century, bringing with it an existential threat that would completely reshape the destiny of the entire European continent. Far to the south, beyond the snowy peaks of the Pyrenees, a massive, vibrant new empire had swept across the globe. The Umayyad Caliphate, carrying the banner of a rapidly expanding Islamic faith, had conquered Hispania and was now sending vast, highly mobile cavalry forces over the mountains into the fertile plains of southern Gaul. The Duke of Aquitaine, who had previously been fiercely independent from the Franks, was completely crushed by this overwhelming southern tide. In absolute desperation, he rode north, abandoning his pride to beg for the protection of the Franks. But he did not go to the Merovingian king, sitting lazily in his ox cart. He went directly to the mayor of the palace, an incredibly powerful, deeply terrifying man named Charles. Charles recognized immediately that this was not a simple border raid, but a massive invasion that threatened to swallow the entire Frankish world. He gathered the combined military might of the Frankish realms, calling upon the fierce, hardened infantry of the deep northern woods. The two massive forces finally met in the year 732 at the Battle of Tours, returning once again to the very same sun-drenched, dusty plains of Poitiers, where Clovis had crushed the Visigoths centuries earlier. I always try to picture the incredible, suffocating tension of the standoff that preceded the battle. For 7 entire days, the two immense armies simply watched each other across the dry autumn grass. The Umayyad cavalry, light, incredibly fast, and accustomed to sweeping, overwhelming charges, waited for the heavily armored Franks to break their formation and step out of the protective cover of the trees. But Charles was a brilliant, cold-blooded tactician. He absolutely refused to take the bait. He ordered his men to lock their wooden shields together, planting their heavy boots deep into the earth, creating an impenetrable, bristling wall of iron spears and heavy axes. when the Umayyad cavalry finally lost their patience and launched a massive, thundering charge across the plains. The result was a catastrophic collision of two entirely different worlds. The ancient Christian chronicles describe the Frankish infantry standing absolutely immovable, like a massive, unyielding wall of ice, freezing the terrifying southern cavalry. Charge completely in its tracks. The brutality of the close-quarters fighting was unimaginable. A blinding, deafening storm of clashing iron, screaming horses, and choking dust. But the Frankish shield wall simply would not break. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the trampled grass, the Umayyad commander was struck down in the heavy fighting. Under the cover of total darkness, the invading army quietly abandoned their tents and retreated back toward the mountains. Charles had won a monumental, world-saving victory. For his sheer, terrifying, unyielding strength on that battlefield, he was forever granted the legendary title Martel, which simply means the hammer, with the echoing ring of the hammer striking the anvil of history. The absolute irrelevance of the Merovingian kings was finally undeniable clear to the entire world. Charles Martel ruled Gaul as a king in everything but name, and when he passed his immense power down to his son, a fiercely intelligent man named Pepin the Short, the final, inevitable curtain fell on the bloodline of Clovis. Pepin was no longer satisfied with standing in the dark shadows behind the throne. He wanted the heavy golden crown to sit upon his own head. But to usurp the sacred, divinely appointed royal bloodline was a massive, dangerous political risk. So, Pepin executed a brilliant piece of international diplomacy. He sent a simple, highly profound question directly to the Pope in Rome. He asked, concerning the kings of the Franks, who no longer possessed any actual royal power, if this state of affairs was right. The Pope, who desperately needed the military protection of the powerful Frankish armies against his own enemies in Italy, replied with a heavy, history-altering decree. He stated that it was better to call the man who possessed the actual power king rather than the man who possessed absolutely none. With the supreme, divine blessing of the Catholic Church secured, the final, incredibly quiet revolution took place. There was no brutal assassination in the deep woods. There were no poisoned daggers or bloody massacres in the dark stone halls of Paris. In the year 751, the very last Merovingian king, a pale, quiet man named Childeric III, was gently removed from his wooden throne. Picture this profoundly melancholic, peaceful end to a dynasty born in such terrifying violence. The heavy golden crown was simply lifted from his head. He was taken to a quiet, isolated, heavily shadowed stone monastery. There, surrounded by the soft chanting of monks, the cold, sharp blades of iron shears were brought to his head. His incredibly long, beautiful, flowing blonde hair, the absolute, sacred symbol of his ancient, mystical royal bloodline, was slowly and methodically cut away, falling uselessly to the cold stone floor. He was given the simple, rough woolen robes of a monk and was allowed to live out the rest of his quiet days in absolute obscurity, praying in the dark, damp silence, while Pepin the Short was anointed with holy oil as the first true Carolingian king of the Franks. And so, the violent, chaotic, deeply fascinating origins of France come to a peaceful, fading close. The wild, pagan tribes of the dark, freezing Hercynian forest, the men wrapped in heavy furs, who threw their iron axes across the muddy Rhine, had completely transformed. They had conquered the mighty Romans. They had absorbed the refined, sun-drenched wealth of the Mediterranean. They had knelt before the quiet altars of the Catholic Church, and they had permanently stamped their name upon the very soil of Europe. Francia, the land of the Franks. France, when I walk through the beautiful, peaceful French countryside today, listening to the gentle breeze, rustling through the leaves of the ancient oak trees, and watching the golden sunlight fade over the quiet, endless vineyards, I often think about the incredible depth of the history sleeping quietly right beneath the soil. Every cobblestone, every winding river, and every crumbling stone wall holds the faint, echoing memory of the warlords, the saints, the queens, and the nameless warriors who lived, loved, and died to forge this nation. The clash of iron and the heavy, terrifying roar of the battlefields have all long since faded away, replaced by the slow, comforting rhythm of the turning seasons. The wild wolves of the ancient forest have finally gone to sleep, and the vast, beautiful land they left behind rests peacefully under a blanket of quiet, shimmering stars. I hope that as this journey through the deep, misty centuries comes to an end, you too can find a profound, comforting stillness. Let the heavy weight of the world fade away into the shadows, just as the ancient empires have faded into the dust of time. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift safely into a deep, peaceful, and truly restful sleep.